When the title came, everyone liked it, but wide range of people. It was in the New Left Review said it's funny and good. But then some journalist interviewed me and said, well, nobody can please all. Well, it's not just you. So I said, this is absolutely true. So I must clarify it. So in the preface to my book, I clarified this further and said that my meaning is somewhat different from others who've used this. For me, a correct reading of "you can't please all" is as follows. In your political and intellectual functioning, you don't have to please anyone at any time. That made it totally clear. Myself and most of my generation of activists were aware that we were being spied on in some way or the other. When in the 1980s I moved sideways from politics, doing a lot more cultural work, filming, etc., I did occasionally wonder, are they still spying? I mean, could it be that they're still watching me? And I had no idea. And then one day I was jogging along Hampstead Heath and I got stopped by a bloke who said, "Are you Tariq Ali?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "I'm amazed I found you. We have to just talk." This happens quite a lot, so I try and avoid it usually because it disrupts any exercise one is doing. But he sounded urgent, and as we were walking to a bench, he said, "You changed my wife's life and career." So I said, "How?" And he said, "She used to work for GCHQ, the sort of main British spy headquarters which carries out surveillance." This was in the 90s. And her job was to listen to your conversations. That's all. I was I said, "Ridiculous. Everything?" He said, "Yeah." So he said, "Were you splitting up with your former partner at that time?" I said, "That was in the early 80s. He said, yeah, that's when all this happened. And you used to speak to your 6-year-old or 7-year-old daughter and read stories out to her on the phone each night." I said, "This is true. And occasionally she would cry." I said, "This is also true." He said, "My wife was listening to all that. And she said, I can't take this any longer." So the very next day, she said, "I didn't join GCHQ to spy on the private lives of our citizens," handed in her resignation, and walked out. So I said, "Well, give her a hug from me. I'm very impressed she did this. And had you not met me accidentally and told me, I would never have known." So that was the first real indication I had, was that the spying went on long after the 60s and 70s were over. And then at the SpyCops inquiry, they confirmed that they'd been effectively spying on me since I was at Oxford. And since we had what they called a violent demonstration against the South African ambassador, which was a bunch of 100 people, including Labour MPs, Labour councillors, students, effectively hurling, stale vegetables, which we'd picked up from the market that morning, at the South African ambassador's car. And since that time, it's now become clear that MI5 had opened a file on me. These are files I never saw. And there were other instances as well. I was stopped at Brighton Station one day by a very jovial-looking guy, and he said, "Oh, I owe you an apology, because I was the post office, I was the postie whose job it was to open all the letters coming to you at the address of the Black Dwarf, a newspaper that I edited. And did you know they were opened?" I said, "Yeah, we did, because you were very clumsy." He said, "That was deliberate." I said, often when you, he said, what used to happen, special branch came, the letters had been steamed open, they read them, copied them, photographed them and went away. We then had to put them back and deliver them to you. You never got your letters on time. I said, it's true. And he said, my way of letting you and the other journalists working at the Black Dwarf know this was deliberately we sometimes put someone else's mail in your envelope, so you would wonder. I said, we didn't need to wonder. You were so clumsy resealing it. We knew. And you know, then I met an engineer who said they used to tap your phone. I knew which your phone was. I would unplug it. So lots of confirmation came in, and the SpyCops inquiry confirmed all that. It was very revealing on that front. And I'm glad I did it. But the other thing was that thinking about those times, you know, as late as the 80s and 90s, made me think that these are stories that haven't been told. And no one else is going to tell them because the whole atmosphere and the mood has changed. So perhaps I should follow the advice of some friends and sit down and write the second part of my memoirs, starting from 1980 and bringing it right up to now. My initial reaction to the people who I met by accident at Hampstead Heath, Brighton railway station, Facebook message from the telephone engineer, was that I was quite taken aback because I was not in active politics at the time. I was not a member of any far-left group that I had been in the 60s and 70s. And so I said, what the hell are they spying on me for? Because everything I say or do is public. My views are not hidden. They're in my books or in my documentary films and sometimes even in my novels. So what do they get out of it? And then I thought if it's simply a way of keeping people in employment, I shouldn't object too much because someone's got a job out of it, fine. But in terms of the actual knowledge, it's totally useless. And that's what the preliminary finding of the SpyCops inquiry revealed. In my case, at any rate, they said that after 1968, he should not have been spied upon. The surveillance should have come to an end, which was my view as well. So I had no particular complaints. But you know what angered me was that these charges of spying on private citizens were usually made about the Stasi in East Germany, Eastern Europe, and all that, non-stop. That was a big thing of the West, that in those countries they spy on you. And here you are, it's being admitted that they spied on me and others for 50, 60 years. For no rhyme or reason, we were not threatening state power or the state. That was never the case in Britain. You could say it was partially the case in France and Portugal in those years till 75. It was never the case in Britain. So what were they, pissing around for, quite honestly? The Sunday Times had done an interview with me, a life in the day of Tariq Ali, and in that interview, this was I think in the 80s, I had joked, but they'd asked, what is your day like? So I said, this was in the early 80s, I'd said that every day I talked to Robin Blackburn, my colleague at Verso and New Left Review, and we discuss everything under the sun, light gossip, hard gossip, the state of the world, the storms in a teacup in Mead Street, etc., etc. And I said, if someone is reading your paper, I said to the Sunday Times lady, and they have these files, of Robin and my taped conversations. I'd love to see them because they would make my job much easier of reconstructing the past, because we did discuss world politics most of the time. It was sort of as a joke, but now it emerges they were taping everything. The thing that interested me, not shocked or surprised, because some of the people involved in the surveillance are sort of quite stupid. But one thing at the inquiry, at one point the police lawyer said, "Mr. Ali, we need to ask you one question that involves your personal life. And do we have your permission to do so?" I said, "Feel free." They said, "There is a police report on a visit you made to a northern college in England," something like that. "And the report says that you were later seen in intimate circumstances with the president of the Students' Union." I could remember no such incident, but then I said, "Hang on, was the president of the Students' Union male or female?" And the lawyer replied, "Male." So I said, "No, this is completely made up." And the reason to me is obvious. It's a fake report, designed probably for blackmail purposes at some stage, since homosexuality had been legalized very recently in comparative terms, and lots of people were, didn't want to come out for whatever reason, so they might have thought they could use it to embarrass me. But far from being embarrassed, if it was true, I'd have been very proud. I said it would have done my standing no end of good. My immediate family, my parents, were very important to me. I had a very happy childhood. They were, by and large, pretty relaxed. I was very close friends with my mother, who was 19 when I was born. And it used to tickle her greatly sometimes when we went shopping at special fruit shops, and the fruit shop owner would say to me, "Pick up the bag, don't let your sister carry it." The fact that she was mistaken for my sister appeased her vanity greatly. So my relations with them were very good. And they were both very political, my parents. The family as a whole came from a fairly reactionary feudal background. And, many of them very nice people, but they had nil influence on me. My parents were the people who influenced me. And without them, I would not be the person who I am. Because had I been caught up in the big families, whatever, storms and tribulations, who knows? But my parents were communists in the late 30s and 40s. They had, as I sort of describe in the book, disregarded parental advice. They came from the same family and got married against their parents' wishes, and there's a great brouhaha and scandal, things I found out much, much later. But the most important thing is that our house was often divided. One was family visitors, and the second was that constantly our house was filled with bohemian poets, radical intellectuals, trade union leaders, peasant activists, who came in and out as if it were an everyday, as if it was their house, and they were treated like that. And their company I found incredibly rewarding and stimulating, because they were no respecters of persons or class or anything like that. They chat very openly to me. And so the combination of my parents and very mixed social layers who came in and out of our house, I think, had a big influence on me from a very young age. I was I was political, even at school, and sort of injustice in particular, but horrors of injustice. The horror of injustice was very strong. And one day I read in the newspaper when I was about 15 that the court in the United States had sentenced a black man, Jimmy Wilson, to death for stealing $1. I mean, some of us were sort of, sitting chatting, and I said to a few friends, "Have you seen this?" And they said, "Yeah, it's just unbelievable. I mean, what a barbaric system that can do this." So I said, "We can't just sit here." So they said, "Well, what are we going to do?" I said, "Let's march to the US consulate with a petition demanding that this death sentence be repealed, and that the Consul General convey our protest to whoever, his government, whatever." So it was with great difficulty that we managed to get about 20 students. Some say now people say, no, it wasn't 20, it was 15, whatever. It was a very small, and we marched down the streets carrying a banner saying, save Jimmy Wilson's life, and distributed leaflets. And I mean, one of the things I remember is that some street urchins joined us, and they were so used to chanting against Western names on the streets, presidents or prime ministers of the Western world, that they thought Jimmy Wilson might be an enemy. So when we first started, when we shouted Jimmy Wilson, the reply was "Long live," and these street urchins said "Death too." So we had to control them and buy them cokes and sweets and say, "For God's sake, we're on Jimmy Wilson's side. He's a band expert." Then they were, there's no problem at all. They marched all the way with us to the consulate. Now, the Consul General, I'll never forget him or his horrible name, Dr. Spenkler. Cold, icy, very hard sort of Protestant features which a certain type of American citizen has, in official, just cold as ice. So he said, "Yeah, we got a report that you were on the way. Sit down." So I sat down. He said, "We've just come to hand over this petition to you. We're very shocked that Jimmy Wilson is going to be executed for stealing $1. He said, "You shouldn't believe everything you read in the press." I said, "Is it untrue then? Are you going to deny it? In which case, we're delighted." He said, "Are all your names and signatures on the petition?" We said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, good, you can go. I've received your petition. I'm going to send all your names back to the principal of your school and ensure that you are punished." That was all. That was my first experience of US democracy as a 15-year-old. So when we got back, the principal already had the list and called us in. It was a Catholic school, and the principal, Reverend Brother Henderson, had fought against the Black and Tans, so he had a past. So he said, "Why did you even bother to go? These people don't like listening, especially to you boys in an Asian country." The last big, relatively large demonstration we organized in Lahore, in Pakistan, was in 1961, when I was in not my last year, but I had another year left before I graduated. And news came through that Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Congolese freedom fighters, had been assassinated. Now, I was always more interested in international affairs, in world politics, and I was also vice president of the Students' Union, so I called an immediate meeting. At that time, we had a very good principal who never stopped us doing things like that in the college. And so I called a meeting to condemn the death of Lumumba, and to my astonishment, at 1 hour's notice, about 500-600 students showed up. So I spoke, and I said, this is what has happened. It's just that is a country which has already been exploited by the Belgians. The first independent leader of this country has been killed by the United States. And some said, how do you know it's the United States? I said, nothing happens in this world, in that part of the world, without the United States. So I said we marched to the American consulate, and I was really pleased we were doing that again after Jimmy Wilson. So we marched again to the American consulate, and this time, instead of 15 students, there were about 500-600 of us. And it was illegal to march in the streets because the country was under military rule. It was banned. You couldn't. We said we're going come what way. They've killed Lumumba. If they kill us, so what? What difference does it make? People came, and the cops were taken totally by surprise. And the army, no one had dared to do it. So we went and did our business, and I spoke, and we chanted slogans. And as we were marching back, I couldn't resist it. I said, democracy is a good thing, not just for the Congo, but also for Pakistan. And we chanted anti-military dictatorship slogans, and then ran back into the college precincts where we were defended. But they were so taken by surprise that all they did was ban demonstrations on the streets indefinitely. They were already banned. They banned them again to make it sure, and they banned me from giving political speeches inside the college as well. So that was my last, that was my sort of almost my last political activity in Pakistan. And then I came to study at Oxford, and most of the things, traveling to Vietnam, traveling to India, to other parts of the world, to Palestine, I did from my Oxford perch, and after I'd graduated. And the thing, as I've described in Street Fighting Years, that had a huge impact on me and I think sort of transformed my life forever, was being in Vietnam during the bombing raids, seeing children being wiped out, seeing the effect of napalm on civilians. The whole bodies of children just burnt. They survived. And I was there for, I think, about 4 to 6 weeks. And the Vietnamese, seeing my state after witnessing this, would come and say to me, comrade, we know it's awful. We live through it every day. You will recover after a few weeks. You'll get used to it. I said, I can't get used to this, but I did. It's like the Palestinians have got used to being killed every single day by the Israelis. And lots of people who survive there, they are used to it. And that's an awful reflection on the world we live in. But it's not new. It's been happening for ages. And I observed it in Vietnam. The second thing I observed, we had to travel at night, because during the day the whole country was being bombed. So we would travel at night, arrive in a village, be taken to our quarters to sleep, and the next day we would get up and see the village. And what struck me was in all the villages we saw, 95% of those working were women. Lots of women were fighting as well with the men, but slightly older women or very young women were running the villages. And I asked the people in charge, I said, do they need instructions every day? They said, no, it's their village. They know how it works. They can run it. They don't need upstairs. And that's what the war has done. It's liberated us in many ways. We can do it. It's very impressive, actually, to watch that. India, I visited in the mid-80s to write a book on India. And I had a long interview with Mrs. Gandhi, who was then the Prime Minister, discussing many, many things, and especially India's relations with Pakistan. And the account of that is sort of, I think I've given it for the first time in You Can't Please All. But then I traveled the whole country, different parts of it, and met people, filmmakers like Satyajit Ray, artists like Bhupan Kakkar, dancers like this amazing classical Indian dancer, Chandra Lekha. And she had set up a studio on the beach in Chennai, where she trained young people, especially talented poor kids, free. Wouldn't charge them anything. And I sat with her, I think I spent 3 or 4 days there with her, and just watching her in action, making notes, interviewing. That book didn't come out. It was The Politics and Culture of India, because in the meantime, Mrs. Gandhi had been assassinated. And my publishers, Chatto and Windus and Picador, said, you just have to write a book on the Gandhis, Nehru-Gandhi family, because that's what people are interested in. And so I sat down and wrote that book. I think I had done a lot of the research, but it took me about 4 weeks to finish the book, and Sunny Mehta at Picador brought it out within a few months, and it did extremely well. But more importantly than all that, that's the time I got to know India quite well. The differences between North India and South India. I mean, they were like two different nations. They could have been at some stage like that. But that was very educative. The Vietnam trip was very formative, and just sealed my hatred for American imperialism. Not Americans, because there were Americans with us. And the Vietnamese themselves always differentiated ordinary Americans who are fighting against the war and the American state. It's like today, even, as we're filming, the Palestinians make a difference between all the young Jewish kids who are coming out on the streets of the United States and marching for Palestine, occupying the stock exchange, and the Americans who are arming Israel to the teeth to exterminate the Palestinian nation, because that's what's going on. So that Vietnam experience, actually, soon afterwards, when we came back to London, the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, for whom I used to work, said, better get your clothes packed and cameras ready, because you're going to the Middle East. I said, this was after Israel had destroyed Arab nationalism by defeating Egypt and Syria in a sudden war, the Six-Day War, it's called. And so I went, landed in Jordan, crossed the Allenby Bridge into Palestine, met the refugees in the camps, the continuing war this was another phase of the war against Palestine that had been going on since 1936. Met refugees, talked to them, got their stories, then went to Cairo, to Damascus, to Beirut, being bombed again, and sat down with Palestinian intellectuals and got the story. And what struck me was how ignorant I was. That the stories that were common to Palestinians hadn't reached someone like me who considered himself very political. I knew, of course, the main divide, but the details and what was done in 36, in 48, in 56, in 67, continues. So that was my big lesson about Palestine that I never forgot, and that has stayed with me ever since. And, some years after that, I met Edward Said at a conference at Columbia in New York, I think about 3-4 years after my trip to Palestine. And we became friends and remained friends for the rest of his life. And then there was no way of Palestine ever being out of my thought processes. And I met lots of radical Jewish intellectuals who were working with Palestinians, coming in and out of London, and telling us stories about how Israel was governed, expressing optimism that they just didn't feel that, any substantial part of the Israeli population would go along with any crazed right-wing semi-fascist attempt to destroy the Palestinians altogether. They couldn't believe it. They said they're like us. And one of them had fought in the 48 war, Akiva Or, and he had learned so much. And he taught us, this is how they think, this is what they do. So one got it from both sides, Palestinians mainly, but also Israeli Jewish radicals whose fathers and grandfathers had been rabbis, etc., families destroyed by the Judeocide of the Second World War. And so, as in Vietnam, Palestine taught me a great deal as well. If I'm 100% honest, I will say that I and many of my Palestinian friends and non-Palestinian friends, we used to wonder whether the resistance was finished now, whether the Israelis had completely won, and all that was left was a slow mopping up operation, gradually destroy all the villages on the West Bank, treat Gaza like a giant concentration camp, destroy their will to resist. We used to talk about that quite a lot and think about it quite a lot, but that's all, just think. And then October the 7th happened. My reaction was, I am not in favor of killing civilians. I think it's a wrong tactic, but what was going on effectively was a resumption of the resistance against the Israeli state and its crimes. So the fact that the Western media decided to become pillars of the obvious war that was now going to be waged against the Palestinians didn't come to me as a huge surprise. I mean, the reporting was disgusting, and they now have to go back on it and say some of the things we reported weren't true. No, the Palestinians didn't behead any babies. No, the Palestinians didn't rape people we said they'd raped. Those who beheaded babies, those who killed some of their own people, was the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, so-called. This is now coming out, but I have to say that the one thing that surprised me was not so much the resumption of a long resistance that goes back to 1936 and did not start in October last year, was that the mood amongst many, many young people, hundreds of thousands, millions, was very different from what it had been during the previous wars, where still many gave Israel the benefit of the doubt. And I think my feelings, as I describe them, were not restricted to me. I think large numbers of the Palestinian diaspora were asking themselves the same question. Whether they agreed with Hamas or not politically was something else. You know, when you're in that situation, you have to be deeply sectarian to constantly question the resistance movement. It's like Ireland. When we used to defend, I used to defend in public, and our newspapers did, the right of the IRA to fight back, there was shock and horror. I said, well, you know, I don't agree with them on everything, but they're being left with no option. And finally, they got more or less what they wanted. Ireland isn't united, but it's not that far from it as people think. And so with Palestine, it was the same. The resistance has resumed. And the attempt by the Israelis to wipe them out hasn't worked. I have to say this. I don't want to be over-optimistic because there's enormous power the Israelis have that has been given to them by the United States. And this is something that even the demonstrators and the anti-war movement have underestimated. The massive support without which the Israelis couldn't fight this war that comes from the United States. And I often ask at anti-war meetings, where are the American flags? I see the Israeli flags. Why not American flags? Why not Genocide Joe's portraits on the marches, being burnt or whatever needs to be done to them, or paraded around as sort of portraits of criminals? No reply, which shows how much in some ways the world has changed. But the size and scale of the global demonstrations, and here I have to say, especially in Britain and the United States, has been quite remarkable, quite remarkable. And now some people more cynical come and say to me, yes, but the majority of the country. I said, the majority of the country never goes on marches. It's always a minority. If the majority of the country came out onto the streets, this government would fall. But they don't act like that, except in very rare conditions and circumstances. So the fact that after a year, different people are marching in different ways in cities here and in the United States, which is amazing. And the victimization they're suffering at the hands of the so-called Ivy League universities, sort of blood-colored Ivies, these so-called educationists who effectively do little more than make money, expel students or refuse to give them their degrees. So that resistance has been amazing. And that is what I, talk about in my epilogue in You Can't Please All. I think there's about 3 sections on Palestine. Because obviously while writing this book, the war was going on while finishing it. But also to show readers that this is nothing new. We were saying similar things in 2004. Just to talk about this century, or 2002. When was Gaza last bombed? People will tell you the Palestinians have the dates inscribed on their hearts. and on the gravestones of their families and in Lebanon. And this is going on again. And so I conclude the book on a Palestinian note. And how far the Americans will let the Israelis go remains to be seen, you know. Whether an election result, Trump or Kamala Harris, will make any difference to Palestine at all? I think not. I think unless something more dramatic happens, these occupants of the White House will carry on as before. I mean, you know, it's the electoral system is corrupt in both Britain and the United States. But there's a perfectly decent candidate in the United States, Jill Stein, who I know, Jewish origin, pro-Palestinian, strongly attacking both parties for Gaza and what they have done. And she's now beginning to have an impact as well. She won't win, but were she to get a few million votes, I would be very happy, saying something is shifting. Like in Britain, something has shifted with these independents being elected. So it moves slowly, but it moves. And that, for me, is something relatively new and very positive. Some people who don't know me so well, mainly who don't live in Britain, and there are quite a lot of them, will wonder, and they have already said to me, those who got early copies of the book, we really like this book, but you've got too much on Britain, which is boring. And I say I live in Britain. You know, if I lived in Ireland, it would be less boring. But I live in England, and it's not boring, because I'm basically writing about the things that affected me. And the New Left Review was always a big influence, even when I wasn't part of it. I used to read it when I was at university. And so coming later and working with all these comrades was very important. And then there was a mythology, semi-mythology, that said, that some would say, oh yeah, but the old New Left was better. And, you know, the political argument between Nairn and Anderson and Edward Thompson, Edward won the debate hands down. I said, fine, you can think that. You're right. I disagree slightly. I don't disagree with everything Edward wrote. And then when I met Edward some years later, he was so different from the person who had been imagined largely by a sectarian reading of the intellectual arguments and disputes. And it became very clear to me that Edward had never ever stopped reading the New Left Review. He read it all his life, and he discussed many things with me. And the description that I put in You Can't Please All, which is an account of Edward Thompson and the older generation. I say older because they were older than these young whippersnappers, but they were only in their 40s. Interviewing for a new editor, and Edward's description of the interview with Perry is quite remarkable. And I think that that interview itself will change perceptions in historical accounts of, you know, how they reacted and related to each other. And this became clear later when Edward more or less told me his version of the story. And he said on many things, the young folk were right. The young folk were in their late 20s, early 30s. And so I'm very pleased that I've covered all that section. And, you know, my close friends were in the New Left Review were Quentin, Robin, Perry, then Norman Garras, and then Quentin and Norman Garras shifted their politics after the collapse of communism. That was really the the thing that shifted them, the breakup of Yugoslavia. It was sad because I was very close to them. But Perry, Robin and I remained pretty close. And sometimes our enemies would come up to me in a jokey way and say, "How come you three are still together?" And I would say, it's politics. That's all it is. It's politics and comradeship and friendship. So that's why for me, the New Left Review sections in the book are very important. But I was working with other magazines. Before the New Left Review, I used to, as I described, go and do a fair bit of work for Private Eye, even when I was at Oxford. And then when I moved to London, Richard Ingrams and I became friends. Paul Foote was already there. And I used to attend a lot of Private Eye lunches and write for them regularly, both about UK politics and about the rest of the world. And it was a very enjoyable experience. And then when I joined a far left group in 1968, Ingrams groaned. And when I saw him first after that had been reported in the press, he said, "Traitor, traitor, why did you have to go and join anything?" I said, "Paul Foote, your star writer, is a member of one such group. Why should I be punished?" And they attacked me in Private Eye quite a lot during the 60s. I didn't mind that at all, actually. It's quite funny, some of it. But we never broke up. We always remained friends. And even after Richard left Private Eye and set up the Oldie, we remained friends. I still see him. And I saw him while I was writing the book, which he was very amused by, that I was going to write about Private Eye. And also, in some ways, one of the best experiences when I was regularly attending the Eye and going to the office and having lunches was meeting Claude Cockburn. And Claude Cockburn was a legendary figure for those of us who knew him, as the very excellent book by Patrick demonstrates. But I met Claude before I got to know the brothers. So they were surprised at Alexander's funeral when I said that. But it's absolutely true. Claude was very supportive when we set up the Black Dwarf. He came with me on television chat shows to defend setting up the Black Dwarf, and then would whisper in my ear afterwards, "God, I hope Private Eye don't sack me for saying this." And there was a big debate going on in Private Eye as to how much you could play with the facts. And Claude was always in favor of coloring the facts slightly so as to improve and heighten their impact. And one day over lunch at Private Eye in Soho, I said to Claude, I whispered, but everyone was listening, I said, "Claude, Lenin, whose writings you know well, always used to say, facts are stubborn things." And Claude guffawed. And then he said, "You're a bit more flexible than that." that was his general attitude. But we know one learned just from talking to him and stuff. And despite his humor and his witticisms, he's an incredibly serious journalist. I admired him greatly, and all his three sons have inherited part of that a quality from him. Friendship isn't usually a thing that is dependent on 100% political agreement. It's possible to be friends on some level with people you disagree with, both within the left and outside the left. Eric Hobsbawm, for instance, who I liked, we were friends, we ate regularly with each other, but who was totally contemptuous of far-left politics and often let me have it, saying you people are just completely living in a sort of crazed bubble world and can't you see what's going on? I said, Eric, maybe you're right and maybe you're not, but how come that the worst elements in the Labour Party are using your work to attack the Labour Party left, leave alone people like us? I mean, Tony Benn, Ken Livingstone, etc. Who do you mean? I said, I'll tell you who I mean. Neil Kinnock, who's basically wanting to bump the left out of the Labour Party. You're often quoted by him. I said, I know you'll never say this in public, but could you at least tell me what your real opinion of Kinnock is? Second-rate politician with a third-rate mind. So I said, then we are on the same side. And I used to constantly tease him that secretly he was a Bolshevik still, but just not coming out with it. He used to smile, but Marlene, his wonderful partner, used to get really angry. He's not, Tariq, he's not a Bolshevik. I'm telling you he's not. I said, well, Marlene, I have the right to my view. I think there is a side of him which is a bit Bolshevik, though, he uses it for the wrong reasons. And then one day at the Hay on Wye festival, not long before he died, Christopher Hitchens was questioning Eric. And, some Tories were sort of asking questions. Did you know Philby? Did you know the spies, Cambridge spies who worked for the Soviet Union? And Hitchens turned to Eric Hobsbawm and said, I might as well ask you this, Eric. Had you, when you were at Cambridge at the same time, been asked by the Soviet secret police to spy for the Soviet Union, would you have done so? Not a moment's hesitation, without any doubt whatsoever, since we were fighting fascism, which the British ruling class was not doing. So then afterwards, when I met, so I said, Eric, Marlene denies that you have a Bolshevik streak left in you, but your reply to Hitchens proved me right, and he laughed. So this was a sort of constant banter. And, he was a wonderful historian, not necessarily a Marxist one, but he was a wonderful historian who educated hundreds of thousands of people, students all over the world, writings translated in Portuguese, read in Brazil, in many Indian languages, etc. So I missed him when he went, because arguing with him was often a treat. Why were the police riots in Southall, which were planned, orchestrated and organized by the police, not given the publicity they deserved in investigative journalism? I have to say that I guess one reason is that the people in Southall, largely Asian people and migrants, were, as far as the bulk of the media was concerned, barely existent. They're migrants working, they've come here for work, so what? And no doubt they're troublemakers there. So there was never a serious investigation of Southall till the fascists began going into that area and picking off young students and people who they didn't like because they could speak English perfectly well, etc., etc. So, and also for some reason, I think probably for cultural reasons, even left-wing and radical journalists found it easier to identify with West Indians. They were part of the same culture, broadly speaking. It wasn't the link with slavery at all. It was a cultural thing. There, you know, reggae music, which came a bit later, but dancing. It was you know, the Notting Hill Carnival. Whereas with Southall, these were all Asian communities, and each of these communities had their own rituals. The Sikhs, the Muslims, the Hindus, they worked together, the young people did, against repression. But they weren't as, you know, sexy, if you like, within inverted commas, as young blacks dancing, joking, laughing, you know, rebelling. Southall didn't rebel so much till those events started happening, and then it did. But even after that, there wasn't much writing about them. Now, years later, I mean, almost, you know, half a century later, we have books coming out of one sort or another of what happened in Bradford. Tariq Mahmood has written an account of Bradford. Others have written accounts. There have been mainstream, semi-mainstream books about Southall. But in those days, wasn't sort of, strictly speaking, covered up, but it wasn't taken seriously enough, especially given the fact they'd killed someone on the streets, you know, be it black and blue. We, the group I was with that day, we were beaten so badly that I came to consciousness in the police bus taking us to a police station in Victoria, and denying to any lawyers, that we were in prison. So I was released at 3 in the morning, and my head was in a daze, because they'd truncheoned us so much that we were like this. I didn't even know how I got onto the bus. And a West Indian rock band, Misty in Roots, the lead singer and manager, were in a coma for days to come, you know, for weeks and weeks and weeks. This should have been really big news. This is what's happening in our city, in our country. But it wasn't. There was reporting, but, you know, implying that the victims had gone out to create trouble. And the Labour Party was awful, the local Labour Party, just awful. They didn't help, they didn't come to our defense, they did nothing. So the experience actually reminded me of how the British used to operate in the colonies. It was an exact replica of what they had done in Indian and African cities when they were ruling those parts of the world. I mean, the police had no excuse to do what they did to us, and they were obviously worked up into a frenzy to do it, that the special patrol group kept on beating and truncheoning poor old Blair Peach, that they killed him. They said, you know, the statements, there was no intention. Well, there was no intention. The intention was to crush that demonstration. And once you have intentions like that, you know, you can kill people. The French do it regularly to this day. The British were more restrained at home, but, you know, they did it on that day in Southall. And I find it shocking that these events still are. I mean, there's been some documentaries recently, but by and large, how these events came about have not yet been fictionalized or put in film or stuff like that. It's once a very one-sided view of what race was in Britain. The Asian component of it has not been covered well, which is why I wanted to start with writing a chapter on Southall, even though the book is 1980 and this happened in 1970. And the government made no apology, the Labour government, no apology whatsoever that this had happened. Obviously, some Labour MPs were shaken, but very few. And then we got Thatcher, and then, there were no limits. Tony Benn and Ken Livingstone said to me, "You've got to join the Labour Party, we need people like you." So, slightly naively, I have to say, I thought if Tony is saying it, it'll be, easy. And it was easy. I was living in Hornsey at the time, and the Hornsey Labour Party was a left-wing party, and I applied for membership. Jeremy Corbyn, who was the secretary of the Labour Party, gave me my Labour Party card the next week and said, "Welcome to the Labour Party." Little did he know that this created a storm, because I announced all this in an article in The Guardian. And he said, we have to try and transform Labour into a socialist party which does something for those who elect it and stuff like that. This angered the Labour Party leaders. I'm not surprised. And they ordered the Hornsey Labour Party to take back my card, which Diana Menz, bless her, refused to do. She said, "Why?" There were pitched battles, not pitched battles, but fisticuffs as the right. Poor old Diana, her necklace was torn off in a dispute by someone now very respectable, Peter Kellner, the cephalogist. They were not so respectful inside the Labour Party. And so I knew it was going to be a long haul. And ultimately, there was a big debate about it in The Guardian. And Neil Kinnock, Michael Foot was the leader, Neil Kinnock working under him. And Kinnock wrote these letters to The Guardian saying, unless Tariq Ali admits that the only way we will get socialism is through the repeated experience of Labour governments in Parliament, his place is not in the Labour Party. Raymond Williams had a very sharp reply to that in a pamphlet. So it was an interesting debate. Finally, I was invited to the NEC meeting. And, here you saw all these people who had been in Labour governments for a long time. And they said, quite funny, one of the questions they asked, "How can we be sure you've left the IMG?" I said, "Well, I assume you have surveillance reports. Check with the special branch whether I'm still in the IMG, because if you don't believe me, which you're obviously disinclined to do, check with them whether I have or not." Yeah. And then they said, who was it? I think someone, right-wing MP, asked, "Do you still consider yourself a Marxist?" I said, "Yeah, I do. But since when has that been disallowed?" I said, "The Labour Party is full of Marxists of one sort or the other." Anyway, though, it was a foregone conclusion, and I think I was defeated by 13 votes to 7. Amendments to delay the process by the Labour left were defeated. And at the next party conference, we had a very small share of the bloc vote. I don't know. I was defeated by God knows how many millions. So that was that. But the interesting thing about this is the following. I was once going for a walk, and the editor of Tribune, Dick Clements stopped me and said, I haven't seen you since the unfortunate episode with the Labour Party leaders. I said, I'm beginning to think it's quite good they did that. Just think of the bloody time one would have to waste it. And he said, you know why they did it? So I said, no. He said, no one, was opposed to you as such, and they knew that everything you said was truthful. But just the very debate on you, we had received 4 requests from constituency Labour parties, safe Labour seats, asking whether you could be their next candidate. So I said, that never occurred to me. I didn't particularly apply for membership to get into Parliament. He said, yeah, we know that. But the constituency Labour parties didn't. And that, he said, is what Michael Foot and Kinnock and the soft left, what you call the soft left, decided that'd be very dangerous at the moment, given we have a Thatcherite government. So I just burst out laughing, and then years later I ran into Neil Kinnock at some embassy dinner, and he said, hi, we're great admirers of the Bandung file, Glenys and I. Said, yeah. Someone walked up to Kinnock and said, Mr. Kinnock, now you're shaking hands and laughing, but do you remember the time when you kept him out of the party? And Kinnock said, yeah, it was a very bad time for the Labour Party. If he applied now, he would be let in immediately. And I said, let me make this clear in front of these 10 or 12 people. I must thank you for keeping me out. I said, I've been so productive and done so many things and will carry on doing that. And being a member of Parliament would have been the death of me, so thank you so much. And that is my view. I met Hugo Chavez for the first time in Porto Alegre, where we used to have these annual anti-Davos gatherings. And he'd just been elected president of Venezuela. He asked for a group of intellectuals who he wanted to meet, and his chief of staff, Max Arvele, organized it. And so I went and met him. I mean, who else was there? Naomi Klein, I think Emir Sader from Brazil, others, And so we chatted away, and then at the end of it, he grabbed me, literally, and said, I need to say something to you. I said, what? When are you coming to Venezuela? We've been in power for some time. Come, have a look. I said, I'll come whenever you invite me. So I did. I made, many trips to Venezuela. And once we were celebrating the anniversary of the defeated coup in 2003, I think. And huge, millions of people on the streets celebrating, and Chavez spoke. And I'd never quite heard, I've heard Fidel's speeches, not in person, but on the screen. But Chavez's speech covered everything. What people were eating at home that week, the constant American plans to topple him. And then at one point he said, the Venezuelan bourgeoisie, who have got so used to ruling this country, attack me for being vulgar. Why am I vulgar? Because I like singing songs. So, you could see the ripples of laughter. So I want to ask you, he asks a crowd of 2 million people, I'm feeling in the mood for a song. Should we go for it? Yeah! So he then sings a popular song. And then he tells a story which had a real impact on all of us, actually, because there are quite a few people from the New Left Review there too. And then he said, when they set up this fake president to replace me with, they ordered, he said, the military band that plays when a foreign guest arrives at the palace, that the new president was being sworn in, and the world media would be there, and they had to play their best version of the national anthem. So he said they'd set all this up, and the next day the military band was gathered in the palace gardens, and the general there said, "Okay, let's start playing." No one moved. And the general ordered the conductor of the band, "Please start playing." The guy said, "Sir, they don't want to play." He said, "What?" And then, despairing, there was a 16 or 17-year-old kid, a bugler. And the general ordered him and said, "When the foreign guests arrive, you just play the bugle. It'll be very impressive. Forget the rest of the band." And the kid didn't reply. And the general, one of the coup makers, said, "Can't you hear what I'm ordering you to do, boy?" And this kid replied, "General, my parents voted for Chavez. Chavez is not the president we elected. I don't want to play the bugle for someone who is not elected." The general then was probably going to hit him or something, and the boy did an amazing thing. He handed the bugle to the general, saying, "General, you seem to be very keen that someone plays the bugle. Why don't you have a go?" Now, this story being told to huge crowds, he had this power to raise political consciousness in a very unusual way. Fidel did it as well, but Fidel's speeches were, very explanatory, more intellectual even. Chavez had read enormous amounts, knew the history of the continent probably better than Fidel even. But that story just, bowled us all over. And then, I began to go regularly and see him and chat to him and talk to him. And one day he came up to me, I can't remember which city we were in, and said, "You're looking very tired today. You should go to bed early." I said, "I want to go to bed early, but how long do you think you're going to speak for now?" He said, 4 hours, no more, I promise. So I said, right. And I gave him, he was still alive when I gave him a copy of The Pirates of the Caribbean that was so published. She looked up and liked the cover and all that. So, we became friends, really, and talked a lot. And I was very shocked when he developed this cancer. And then the speed with which he died. And prior to that, I'd had an informal chat with senior Cubans on some occasion in Venezuela. And they said, "Tariq, do you think the Americans will kill Hugo Chavez?" I said, "They tried to kill Fidel so many times, exploding cigars and all this. They won't assassinate him because that'll be too obvious and could even spark off a civil war in the whole continent, because Chavez was very popular at that time." So I said, "I don't think they'll go the usual route." And the Cuban looked up and said, "Well, what route do you think they'll take?" I said, "I don't know. But given that Chavez is not living with anyone, he's a bachelor, infiltrating a woman is a time-honored method for spy networks. You don't suspect, you're not in your guard, and the deed is done." And this Cuban said to me, "That's really strange you say that. Fidel said exactly the same thing." So I said, well, fingers crossed. Now, when Chavez died so quickly, I'm normally not at all conspiratorial or paranoid or anything. I did wonder. So I spoke to Maximilian, who had been his chief of staff. And I said, "Max, was there some woman who no one knew who she was. He said there was one, an American. And he said even when she was still with him, Chavez began to say to people very close, there's something odd about her. So I said, well, that would have been the moment to investigate her and find out what she was up to. And he said, who knows, maybe it was already too late. I then consulted a top American surgeon who now works for the World Health Organization. I said, is it possible to inject things that give you cancer? She said, are you thinking about Chavez? I said, yeah. She said, I would have to see his x-rays and then I could tell you. But the short answer is yes, there's nothing that medical science can't do. Fake heart attacks, all this. She said, cancer is a bit, there are easier ways. I said, but what if you don't want to go the easy way? You don't want people to believe there's any. So she said, well, cancer obviously is quite useful. I'd had no details, so the conversation stopped there. And in the last few days, weeks before he died, he told his close colleagues, including Maduro, I think I've been poisoned. No history of cancer in any family, so all we could do was shed tears, really. There was nothing more to be done. But he was an incredibly courageous guy when it came to taking on the United States, I'm really pleased I wrote that chapter back in the USSR because they were the most exciting times politically, which many people don't realize, including on the left. They have no idea what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time. I mean, effectively, a huge political debate had erupted throughout the country, not just at the top levels, or not just in intellectual circles, but in factories, in the countryside of what is the future of our country. And Gorbachev said, come what may, glasnost, freedom of speech, freedom of the press is here to stay. It'll never go away. And so the Soviet press was filled with debates on a much, much higher level than anything in the Western media at that time. So it was very exciting, and I was invited to go there by senior people in the Gorbachev wing of the party. So I traveled, I observed, I interviewed, I saw, and I hoped, and that hope was that something would change. And I remember now sitting at the homes of people. The wife had a picture up of her father, the husband had a picture up of his grandfather, and I would ask, who are they? And they said, they are people, our parents, grandparents, killed by Stalin. So that was quite common. But despite all that, they were very excited by what was going on. And I said to them, if you think that following the capitalist road and mimicking the West is a solution, please believe me, it isn't. And some of them would say, but we want to be like Scandinavia. I said things are not going too well there either, but they're tiny countries, the Scandinavian countries. You might want to be like Scandinavia, but you'll end up like Brazil. This was a debate. We know the Western left has benefited from the existence of the Soviet Union. We helped to bring colonialism to an end. We supported Vietnam, Mandela. I said, no, that's all great. We don't have any differences. We might have some, but that's not the point. The point I'm making is that if your economy slips out of your hands, you've had it. But these people are ruthless. And I said the Russian equivalents of these people will even be more ruthless because it'll be new for them, all fresh, make money, make money, make money. So these debates went on, and I did a lot of interviews with some very fine people. And the West was absolutely amazed that Gorbachev didn't lay down conditions for effectively dismantling the system. You know, you're offering the West Eastern Europe, okay, take it. Don't you demand anything? And then I met senior people who told me, including someone who later became Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, we pressed Gorbachev, saying, do not let these countries go unless we get something in return. So I said, what did you want in return? They said, we wanted a neutralized Germany, and we wanted NATO and the Warsaw Pact to be ended at the same time, and a real peace dividend. And Gorbachev could have got away with a lot of that had he tried. But they preferred to trust these Americans. And he said these Western politicians are adept at flattering people they think are coming their way anyway. And he said Thatcher and Reagan, flattered the pants of Gorbachev. There were quite a few people who were very upset. The sort of old bureaucracy was upset, but they couldn't deal with it. But there was a layer within Gorbachev circles who knew this could be a disaster. And they were proved. They were proved right. And then an intelligent government in the United States, as some of its advisors were telling it, should have done some deal on their own. And they refused to do that. They had it. Why should we? The German Chancellor pledged to Gorbachev, there will never be any German soldiers or weapons or bases on what was once East Germany, the DDR, German Democracy. Just a joke. So effectively, they took him for a ride. And the Chinese advice to Gorbachev, Deng Xiaoping said, we don't like glasnost, i.e. freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but okay, that's your business. But we do know a bit about the economy. Do not hand everything over. Just don't do it. Basically, don't allow the party to disintegrate. The party must keep control of the political life of the country and of the economy. But you can, of course, get in foreign investment. Basically, the Chinese method of the Gorbachev said, glasnost cannot be touched. That is what the people really like, the freedom to speak their minds. So I think about that period sometimes when I was there, and what is happening in the West now, the sort of rule of the extreme center, where we are now in a situation in London where meeting places are denied to stop the war movement on Palestine, where if you say you want to organize a book launch for a Palestinian cause, the Conway Hall will refuse. The Conway Hall in central London, which has been for decades a meeting place for dissenters, we can't use it because they've got scared by the government, or I don't know what, or has someone bribed them? I have no idea. But this happens more and more and more. Universities can't be used for this. So the restrictions on democratic functioning, when both the conservative Home Secretaries and Yvette Cooper, when she first came in, extremism must not be allowed on the streets. What are you talking about? What they're all talking about is the Palestinians, and anyone speaking up for the Palestinians. I remember shocking some people when I said, before one of the demonstrations to a radio interviewer, they came and said, Mr. Ali, the Home Secretary has said that these are hate marches. And I just, for once, not for once, but I lost my temper and said, yeah, they are all hate marches, we hate her. And that was a fact, and everyone laughed. But this attempt to curb the marches, just ridiculous. It's happening in the United States. In Germany, the situation is unbearable. Young anti-Zionist Jews being beaten up on the streets by German soldiers who have been told that they're defending Israel to make up for the crimes of yesteryear. Just unbelievable. In France, it's been very bad too, except recently they've allowed Palestinian marches to take place. In Berlin, they are told you can only march on the pavements. What a joke, When I wrote The Extreme Centre, there was still some notion that the centre-right and centre-left were doing the same things, but with possibly a few differences here and there. Now we have a situation where both centre-left and centre-right are wooing the extreme right. Macron in France, the only politician he meets with a big vote is Marine Le Pen. Jean-Luc Mélenchon and all the others, no, we can't deal with them. So it's a sort of coming together of the extreme centre with the extreme right, which looks like the fate of Europe at the moment. It's the worst I've known it since I came to this continent. You look what happened in Austria, far-right victory, far-right triumph. In Germany, the far right is growing. In France, it's growing. In Italy, it's in power. So they're not fascists like the 1930s type, but they're descended linearly from that current. And of course, they don't need to behave like those fascists did, because nothing much threatens capitalism. So, but they're, authoritarian in their way and a mode of functioning. So it's a grim situation, really, in the whole of Europe at the moment. And in this country, this is a government which came to power a few months ago, and already Keir Starmer's ratings have completely plummeted. And according to the opinion polls, Rishi Sunak is ahead of him. This is a Labour government just elected with a huge parliamentary majority based on, rigged figures, because it's not a proportional representation, but still doing nothing. All the opposition from the Labour Party slowly being weeded out. So there's hardly anywhere in Europe one can look at today, with the marginal exception of Spain, who've been good, very good on Palestine in not accepting the American point of view and in taking on the far right in their own country. So with that particular exception, it's a complete mess. And there's no point in getting depressed about it. We have to fight back however we can, whatever way we can. We shouldn't sit still. I think that with the exception of France, where you have a very striking left party in La France Insoumise, which is by and large done very well. And you can't have any perfect parties around who agree with every single thing we believe in. So Mélenchon is way ahead of anyone else. And then there have been lots of criticisms of Wagenknecht in Germany. And I don't agree with her line on immigration, obviously. But on most other things, she is an oppositionist. Which other political leader in Europe you say, well, what do you do in your spare time? Do you read? And the reply comes, yes, I read Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Marx. So, you have to sort of take what is available, despite disagreements with any of these political organizations. So we'll see what happens, but the general current is moving to the right. And I have to say that one of the things that has moved lots of Germans to the right in supporting the AfD is Ukraine. They did not want to be told what to do by the Americans. The extreme center government said we can't disagree with the Americans. So they abandoned any independence, not that they had too much, but they could have insisted on a negotiated settlement early on, which we are now told by Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, all that we proposed to them was fake to deceive them. So if you're not for what do you want? War everywhere? With people threatening both Putin and the other, saying, yes, we can fight a nuclear war. I mean, what is this? And the political classes are just, quite honestly, dead. Both the parties in Britain, the SNP, in which one had some hopes that something might come in a very sad way. I was very sad. I knew Alex Salmon and liked him. I didn't agree with him, but I liked him. I thought he's a genuine politician. And he was hounded out of office and then drops dead. So there's no one else at the moment. Their Ireland is interesting because of Sinn Féin's victory in the north, which who would have imagined that when we were much younger? And I think it's not impossible that at some stage we might see a new unified Ireland. And that's something the majority of the Irish people have been fighting for over a century. And if that happens, it'll be something. But otherwise, Europe has given up its independence to the United States. You know, I was debating Malcolm Rifkin, the former Conservative Foreign Secretary, and I noticed that they constantly refer to the United States as the dominant power. And then the dominant power told us to do this afterwards. I said, Malcolm, is this a new one, or has the Foreign Office always referred to the US as the dominant power? Because I said we know who they dominate, of course, so it probably comes easier to you, but it's much more than just a dominant power.